Well, welcome everyone to this special session of Produce Industry Virtual Office Hours. I am Beth Demings, the IFS at CU's coordinator, and I'm excited to welcome you here today for what I will predict is going to be a very informative session. Before we get started today, I wanted to let you know that our Cornell Food Science Extension team has created a monkeypox fact sheet for the food industry. And based on current guidance from the CDC, the World Health Organization, and the EPA. Importantly, monkeypox is much less deadly and much less transmissible than COVID-19. There have been fewer than 16,000 cases in the US and 0 deaths have been reported to date here. So, however, with the harvest season upon us here in the Northeast, and many of you are welcoming temporary workers to your farms, we just want to make sure that you know that there is information available from the CDC on considerations that you can take to help reduce monkeypox transmission in congregate living settings, like housing for your seasonal farm workers. So I would recommend that anyone on this call who is housing temporary farm workers read through these considerations posted on the CDC's website. I'll drop that link to the fact sheet that's posted on the IFS at CU's webpage and a direct link to the CDC's website with these considerations for reducing that monkeypox transmission in congregate living settings in the chat box in a moment. And so now on to today's program, which is why you're all here. We will hear from our colleagues at the Produce Safety Alliance and from the New York State Department of Ag and Markets. They are going to cover 3 topics that are impacting fruit and vegetable growers, including the proposed changes to the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, agricultural water requirements, impacts to our food safety as a result of soil amendment and fertilizer supplies, and then finally, the new traceability resources that are from the New York State Produce Traceability Blue Ribbon Task Force. Following the presentations, we are going to open the floor to the Q&A. As a reminder, if you are joining us on the phone, you can unmute yourself or mute yourself using *6 to ask questions. Anyone who's joining us online, you can just unmute your mic to ask a question, or we have that chat box. You can always type your question in there. And I will introduce our panel and our presenters for today. So on the call today, we have Dr. Betsy Bihn. She is the director of the Produce Safety Alliance, the executive director of the Institute for Food Safety, and a senior extension associate at Cornell University. Betsy's extension program aims to reduce microbial risks to fresh fruits and vegetables by developing engaging and effective educational materials developed through collaboration with growers, farm workers, produce industry personnel, students, teachers, and consumers. Betsy earned her BS from The Ohio State University in zoology, her MS from the University of Florida in horticulture, and her PhD from Cornell University in food science. Joining Betsy from the Produce Safety Alliance are 2 of her team members, Donna Clements and Davis Blasini. Donna is the PSA coordinator and Northeast Regional Extension Associate. Donna joined the PSA in 2015, originally as the Southwest Regional Extension Associate. She not only has extensive experience conducting produce safety training programs, but she also has direct experience in production, harvesting, post-harvest handling, and sales of perishable products from working on her family's fruit and vegetable farm. Donna received both her BS and MS degrees in plant science from the University of Maryland. Davis is one of the PSA's Spanish language extension associates, and he has experience co-leading and teaching NASDA's on-farm readiness reviews and PSA grower trainings in Spanish. Davis received his Bachelor of Science in Biology at Northeastern Illinois University and his Master of Science in Biology from Arizona State University. Also joining this panel, we have Jennifer Trodden. She's the Deputy Commissioner from the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. As Deputy Commissioner, Jennifer oversees 3 of the department's largest divisions, the Division of Food Safety and Inspection, Milk Control and Dairy Services, and the New York State Food Lab. And Jennifer has an extensive compliance and policy background, and as the primary food safety advisor for the department, is integrally involved in policy and programmatic issues affecting broad areas of food safety across both New York State and the US. Jennifer serves on the National Association of State Departments of Ag's Produce Safety Implementation Group and is a member of that same organization's Food Safety Steering Committee. Jennifer's been executing public policy for 20 years, holds a master's degree in environmental health from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, is a certified safety professional, an advisory member on numerous boards across the New York State, and is also currently enrolled in the Juris Doctorate program at Northwestern University in California. And with those introductions of this really great panel that we have set up for today, I'll pass it over to you, Betsy.
Thanks, Beth. That was a fantastic. And we are super happy that we have this opportunity to collaborate with the IFS at CU to be part of this webinar. Donna, I believe, is going to share the slides with us today. We're going to work through, as Beth mentioned, we're going to work through those topic areas. Ooh, that's a beautiful thing. Next slide there, Donna. Focusing on the proposed changes to subpart E of the Produce Safety Rule, and really just to bring people up to speed where we're at currently with that. Donna's going to talk about soil amendment supply chain issues that are related to, I believe, some of what we're still seeing as remnants of the COVID outbreak with supply chain issues related to chemical soil amendment availability that is leading people towards biological soil amendments of animal origin, and talk a little bit about what the PSR says about that. And then we're going to talk about the FSMA Produce Traceability Rule, and that is why Jen Trodden from New York State Department of Ag and Markets has joined us, because they had a very big effort that I think led to a really productive educational material to help all growers and all those in the produce distribution system think about traceability as we continue to have outbreaks. It's no secret we've got one going on right now in the Midwest. It's good to think about traceability. Well, Davis Blasini is also on the call, and he definitely helped with the slide. Hi, Davis. Slide development, and is also going to be posting stuff in the chat box as we go. So I'm glad he's with us today. Next slide. We did want to remind folks that the Produce Safety Rule is part of a set of rules that are part of the Food Safety Modernization Act. We went ahead today and added the proposed rule for food traceability. So when we talk about traceability, it's not specifically related to the Produce Safety Rule, but will impact those who are looking at produce safety. So that's why we wanted that balance here with this slide. Next slide, Donna. I'm going to start us off talking about subpart E. So the standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption relating to agricultural water. For those of you that are familiar with the PSR, you will know that they released certain provisions when the rule was released in 2015. But then they quickly said, okay, we're going to revisit this and rethink about subpart E, which is the agricultural water provisions. In December of last year, December 2nd, 2021, they released the proposed subpart E. And the main thing we're seeing is the difference. So the 10,000 foot view is that we're moving from testing as being the sole metric and determinant to a more holistic look at the agricultural water system by doing an agricultural water assessment. Some people are calling this an AGWA, but that's kind of what we're talking about. The expectation here is for growers to set their own standards by looking at their whole agricultural water system and understand why they've made the choices they've made to determine if it's safe or unsafe. And the thing we want to add here is they should know enough about it to explain it to inspectors when they show up. Because imagine it from an inspection side of the plate, you're going to all these different farms, and all these different farms are probably going to be using different ways to evaluate their agricultural water system, right? So that's sort of the 10,000 foot view. If we go to the next slide, we're going to break it down a little more specifically to what's in the rule. And growers would be required to evaluate factors of their agricultural water system, including the ag water system in general. So looking at sources and locations of these sources. Is your irrigation pond out in the middle of a field? Is your irrigation pond near a sewage treatment plant, right? Are you taking water from a river that is out in the middle of nowhere? Or are you taking water from a river that is near rural septic tanks, right? All of those things. The water distribution system, is it open or is it closed? Degree of protection from other possible things, animal impacts, wildlife, domesticated animals, adjacent land uses. So that's one piece of it. Ag water practices, the type of application method, drip, furrow, overhead, when is that being applied, the time interval between your last application and your harvest. Looking at crop characteristics, susceptibility of the crop to adhesion and internalization, right? What is likely to stick to the crop, or what are researched outcomes that we can point to tell you there might be risk in certain places. Environmental conditions, frequency of rain or extreme weather events that might impact your ag water system. If there's anything we're all familiar with recently, it's how the environment is changing in many of our agricultural areas. Some of our ag areas aren't getting any water, and some of our agricultural areas are getting 6 inches of water in 30 minutes. So all of those things have to be accounted for. Air temperatures goes with what I just mentioned, as well as your sun and UV exposure. And then other impacts and factors. The interesting thing is here, you'll note it says results of testing. A lot of growers thought when the new rule came out, woohoo, testing's gone. Well, testing's not gone. It's just where you think about it and how you think about it. Next slide. And I want to stress, this is all proposed. I know I've said that a few times, but it's worth mentioning again. So when we look at this agricultural water assessment, the farms would have to use those assessments to determine if they needed to use corrective measures or mitigation measures. And we've gone ahead, and if you look at the orange bar in this graph, ag water is not safe and not of adequate sanitary quality. So what that means is a grower has gone ahead and done their agricultural water assessment. They've determined it's not safe or not of adequate sanitary quality. They need to immediately discontinue use of that water and then take corrective measures before using that water at pre-harvest, okay? So those corrective measures would be re-inspecting the entire ag water system, determining what the problem was, making those necessary changes, or they have the option of treating the water, right, to make it adequate for use in pre-harvest uses. If you move to the blue here, one or more known or reasonably foreseeable hazards related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or human waste, for which mitigation is necessary, they would then have to implement mitigation measures promptly and no later than the same growing season. Again, those mitigation measures are different than the corrective measures. So those mitigation measures would be if you found something that needed repaired, increasing the time interval from application to harvest, increasing the time interval in storage, and other activities. You could change your application method. You could also treat the water or take other mitigation measures. This is where they allow science to come into it. If new research shows there's different measures you can take, you can use that as well. If you move to the next blue box, it looks to be the same, but in this case, the one or known reasonably foreseeable hazards are not related to animal activity, biological soil amendments of animal origin, or human waste, right? And there you implement those mitigation measures as soon as practicable, no later than the following year. So here there's a little bit of a buffer there. And, or you can test the water as part of your AGWA as needed. When you move to the green box, there's no known or reasonably foreseeable hazard for which mitigation is necessary. In that case, you just inspect and maintain your water system and redo this at least once a year. So if you move to the next slide, here what we have done is the corrective measures and mitigation measures that I just mentioned, we tried to pull them out for you. You can see those are supplemental slides that we're using right now for talking to growers about this. But again, looking at those corrective measures, understanding that corrective measures can be different than mitigation measures, and knowing when you're triggered to do one or the other, right? So that's what the result of doing that agricultural water assessment, knowing what you come out with as your answer, and then following that table. Next slide. You're also required to reassess, right? At least once a year, but then anytime there's a significant change in your ag water system, agricultural water practices, your crop characteristics change. This is an interesting one, and we're hoping to get more guidance on it. but does this mean different varieties that look different, grow different? Or if you certainly change crop, that would be a different crop characteristic. Environmental conditions, and we talked about what some of those environmental conditions are, and other things likely to introduce a hazard. So changing to a surface water source, changing a distribution system, how your pipes are working, perhaps moving from a metal system to a plastic system. Any of those times you make changes, you're going to need to evaluate the impact of those changes, see if they introduce new hazards. And then this requires a record that you document whether a corrective or mitigation measure is needed. Okay, so again, think about this. We went from testing to now this more holistic systems approach. Next slide, Donna. In addition to that written record for reassessment, you also are going to need written records of that pre-harvest agricultural water assessment during that initial assessment. And as I just mentioned, also during the reassessment. Talk about the factors you evaluated, whether you think they impacted it. We certainly will be recommending to growers where they can apply science, where we know there's a publication or information, to have that information handy to defend the decisions they're making about risks. Growers testing pre-harvest ag water as part of their assessment, they can certainly still do that. Again, for people that think testing is no longer part of this, they'll need to have a written record of that as well. And then the supervisors are going to have to do this written pre-harvest agricultural water assessment and determination prior to harvesting those crops. Okay. So those are some of the big changes, very summarized for the purposes of this webinar, but that's the general gist of it. I do want to point out in the next slide that there are exemptions for farms that are exempt from conducting this agricultural water assessment if the water meets certain harvest and post-harvest criteria, right? So it meets those standards of no detectable generic E. coli. We put an asterisk here because in the proposed rule, it's not clear that you need to have a written record for this. But in talking with FDA on different webinars that we've been doing, it seems that there's an expectation that there will be a written document that says you are exempt and here's why you think you're exempt, right? That's why the asterisk there, because it's not abundantly clear from the proposed rule. You are also exempt if you receive your public water supply from that meets these established requirements as well. You have those certificates of compliance, and the public water system, you know, is a safe supply of water, right? So we're looking at that. And then if the water is treated in accordance with standards outlined in the FSMA PSR. So if you're treating your water, you can be exempt from conducting that pre-harvest agricultural water assessment. And with that, the next slide is talking about something new. Okay, so that's the proposed rule that came out December 2nd. Recently, I believe it was the 19th of July. I might be off on that. Donna's nodding. It was the 19th of July. FDA came out with proposal for compliance date extension for pre-harvest agricultural water requirements. Okay, important thing I want you to get out of this slide. They are proposing that compliance dates for harvest and post-harvest water come into compliance prior to the pre-harvest agricultural water. Okay, you can see on this slide the compliance for harvest and post-harvest agricultural water, again, water used at or after harvest, come in July 26th of 2023, so that's next January. For all other businesses, those are the ones that make over $500,000. We sometimes call those large businesses. January 26th, 2024, for the small businesses, so that's that group down, that $250,000 to $500,000. And then January 26, 2025 for very small businesses. That's at 25 to 250 level there. Those dates would come in. Whenever the final subpart E is released, which of course also has harvest and pre-harvest water in it, but whenever that's released, from the date that that becomes active, Large businesses, or that all other businesses, would have 9 months from the effective date of that final rule to come into compliance with the pre-harvest water standards, right? The parts that require that agricultural water assessment. Smaller businesses would have 1 year, 9 months, and very small businesses would have 2 years and 9 months, okay? That has complications, but this is what is proposed. And so moving to the next slide, I want everyone to be aware that there is a comment period for comments on the proposed compliance dates for pre-harvest agricultural provisions. The deadline for those comments is September 19th, 2022. And you can submit the comments at that docket. We, as the Produce Safety Alliance, have started talking to growers and we just had a webinar yesterday for our educators in looking at what are some of the concerns with these implementation dates. Some of the concerns that came out are things like bringing the dates in separately could be confusing. 9 months is not enough time from when the final rule comes out and we have all the details to digesting those details, sharing those details with growers and getting them up to speed on that. The important point I want to stress here is if you want to comment, please do, because that's what they need. They need that feedback to know what to do about that. And with that, I don't want to take up any more of my time because Donna is next in talking about soil amendments.
Excellent. Thank you, Betsy. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and briefly talk to you a little bit about soil amendments and some of the new challenges that we're hearing growers talk about in terms of the supply chain and actually being able to purchase the soil amendments that they're accustomed to using. So as you can see here on the slide, we're hearing from growers and we're seeing in the media that growers are being forced to find alternatives to synthetic soil amendments. And there's a couple of reasons for these supply chain difficulties. One is that there are some shortages in the supply chain. Some of it is due to the war in Russia, especially Russia supplies a large amount of synthetic soil amendments. And partially as a result of some of these supply chain issues, we're hearing that the cost of chemical or synthetic soil amendments are increasing. So growers are having difficulty finding soil amendments to purchase, and B, they're being priced out of actually being able to afford some of these soil amendments. So we're hearing that some growers are sort of being forced to switch over to using biological soil amendments of animal origin or BSAAOs, really not because it's a decision that they want to make for their operation, but because they don't have much other option. So I wanted to highlight a new fact sheet that PSA has recently developed, and it's generally an overview of considerations, risks, mitigation steps to take when growers are using biological soil amendments of animal origin. So I have a screenshot here. Davis dropped the link to this fact sheet in the chat box here. And it is pretty short. It's 1 page front and back plus references. And again, what we tried to do here is highlight some of those very broad risks for growers to consider and then point them in the direction of additional resources. So this could be documentation, this could be mitigation measures for growers. And what I wanted to do here in the next few slides is highlight some of those very broad considerations that growers should take when they are using biological soil amendments of animal origin. And in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, FDA has taken sort of they've looked at 2 different categories of biological soil amendments of animal origin when regulating soil amendments in the Produce Safety Rule. So the first category that they look at is what we refer to as untreated biological soil amendments of animal origin. So these are usually going to be manure or improperly compost or incomplete treatments of soil amendments. And the reason these soil amendments tend to be higher risk is that they can carry human pathogens, and certain animals are reservoirs for specific pathogens. So thinking about poultry and salmonella. And in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, the FDA takes kind of a double-pronged approach to managing the risks associated with soil amendments. So the first one is applying a time interval between application and harvest. We spend a little bit of time talking about this in the fact sheet. And then the second one is moving forward and applying a treatment to that soil amendment. So when we looked at this first mitigation measure to minimizing risk when using untreated soil amendments, what the FSMA Produce Safety Rule recommends is applying some kind of application interval between applying the soil amendment and harvesting the crop. I do want to highlight here, because we are talking about updates to the Produce Safety Rule, that there are still no updates to the reserved application interval in subpart F. So the FSMA Produce Safety Rule does not at this time have an established application interval. However, we do know that FDA is still pursuing additional research here in this regard. So in the meantime, what we highly recommend is that growers use the National Organic Program interval, and that is referred to as the 90 or 120-day rule, in which growers apply soil amendments between 90 or 120 days prior to harvest, depending on whether the crop contacts the soil. And research shows us that although we see different things according to the data, research shows us that generally, as you can prolong the amount of time between application and harvest, the incidence of pathogens decreases over time. But I do want to highlight here on this slide that even though there's not an established application interval for untreated soil amendments, the Produce Safety Rule does say that untreated soil amendments, such as manure, must be applied in a way that minimizes contact with produce. So that is very important to mention. And talking a little bit about the second category of soil amendments established in the Produce Safety Rule is treated soil amendments. So growers can use biological soil amendments of animal origin that have undergone a scientifically valid treatment to reduce risks. And the Produce Safety Rule establishes two composting methods. And what it does here is it essentially says, okay, if growers follow these two methods, they've already been supported by science, they're already considered validated. So if growers can follow one of these two treatment methods, it's already considered validated, so that they would just need to keep the appropriate documentation here showing that this treatment has been undergone. And the two different composting methods that are established in the Produce Safety Rule are windrow composting and aerated static composting. I'm not going to go into detail here just because for time reasons, but the thing I want to highlight is both of these methods are aligned with the National Organic Program. And what growers would need to do is really monitor and document these process controls. So in this case, it's time, temperature, and the number of times that these soil amendments have been turned. And I want to highlight here in this slide, one of the illustrations that we developed at the Produce Safety Alliance as part of the More Than Words project with the local food safety collaborative. Davis dropped the link to that project, some of those resources in the chat box if you're interested. But one of my favorite illustrations that came out of this was the biological soil amendments of animal origin illustration. Okay, so now that we talked a little bit about treated versus untreated soil amendments, I want to mention a couple of additional handling recommendations. And these are also recommendations that are highlighted in the fact sheet. So we always recommend that growers designate specific equipment and tools for handling soil amendments, develop SOPs to clean and sanitize equipment. And we do have some sample SOPs highlighted in that fact sheet. And then lastly, to direct traffic, and this includes foot traffic, equipment around soil amendment storage or processing areas. And I really love this photo here, just showing the importance of considering runoff and how these soil amendments are stored and handling, because you can see there's a good amount of runoff here, and you can see the tire tracks just driving right through that runoff. And in this case, going to a field that is not produce, but I do think this is a great photo that sort of illustrates that concept. And then the last thing that I want to highlight in the soil amendment section is the documentation requirements. So this is, these are a couple of resources that we also highlight in the fact sheet that we link to. And I just want to highlight here that there are differing documentation requirements in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule for treated soil amendments. And these are for soil amendments that are treated by the grower or for those soil amendments that are purchased commercially. So if a grower purchases soil amendments, there are some records that they need to show sort of on behalf of the treatment. And then I am going to turn this over to Betsy.
Thanks, Donna. All right, so we're 2/3 through the presentation. Good job hanging in there, everyone. Next, what we want to talk about is the FSMA Proposed Traceability Rule. This was published in September 23rd of 2020, so this is a little older. Keep in mind that we're at 2022. The comment period for this was until February 22 of 2021. The timeline for implementation is expected to be 2 years after publication of the final rule. We are expecting the final rule will show up sometime soon, although we don't have an idea of when that will actually be. You can see the link here if you would like to download it. Next one. What we do want to mention about this produce traceability rule in terms of how it impacts produce. I want to make it clear that this traceability rule covers things far beyond produce, right? So make that clear. This is not part of the PSR. This is its own rule. Produce is in there, but produce is not the only thing that's captured in this traceability rule. Produce items on the list include produce safety rule, covered types or varieties of cucumbers, melons, tomatoes, herbs, peppers, tropical tree fruits, leafy greens, sprouts, fruits and vegetables that are fresh cut. Depending on which grower you talk to, some growers are happy when their commodities are not in there. Other growers are upset that all the commodities are not in there. So just want to make it clear, it doesn't capture all fresh fruit and vegetable commodities, right? So that's the first thing. It also includes biological hazards and acute chemical toxins that are present as an immediate public health risk. And again, there aren't too many acute chemical toxins in produce. This is more capturing other commodities that are in there, such as seafood. But I do want to, just as a summary of that, talk about those things. When we look at the next slide, farm traceability records, they will have to have records of all farm products on the food traceability list. Again, it's a subsegment of fresh produce. Description of the traceability lot code system they're using, description of their traceability records, what records, where, how they're connected together, right? How they're following them through. It also includes key data elements that are most relevant to produce farms, right? So traceability lot codes, new terms, linked to all of the following: product identifiers, quantities, and units of measure. So what is it that you sent, in what kind of boxes, how big, or what kind of containers? I shouldn't say boxes, right? Location identifier and description, where was the produce grown, including a GPS locator, the farm name, the business address, right? If they find a product that has a problem, how do they find out where it came from and how do they cut off the distribution? Identifiers and descriptions of traceability lot code generator and harvest, cooler, and packer if they're different. So again, this may require growers to interact with folks of where the product is going, or somehow streamline what their traceability is, so that once a product is out there, it can be traced back to its area of origin or wherever the contamination happened, because we do know contamination can happen anywhere along the chain. So once there is an outbreak, how do you get to where that contamination happened? And in thinking about these things, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Jen Trodden, because New York State rather proactively had a group working on this. And I would like Jennifer to talk about that group and talk about the document that was created.
Sure. Thanks, Betsy. And thanks for inviting me here today. So our opportunity right before the release of the FDA traceability plan was to form a traceability blue ribbon task force. And the task force was New York State's approach at understanding the produce traceability supply chain, and also what type of traceability systems currently exist in that supply chain. When we formed this task force, we included every sector of the produce industry. We felt it was important to hear from not just growers on the front line, but also distributors, manufacturers, packers, and retailers. Our goal from the very beginning was to understand from each part of that sector what best management practices they had already in place, and then use that information to create a guidance document to help the entire supply chain move forward with produce traceability. Once we created that document, the feedback that we received back was that everybody found that the document was very valuable and helpful, especially the appendices that we put together. On the top right-hand side, you can see our table of contents, where we provided an overview. We created a step-by-step traceability system so that it would easily step, no matter what size of a company was trying to implement a produce traceability plan, it would step them through each step that they would have to follow in order to create that traceability plan. Next slide. In addition to the step-by-step procedure that we put in place, or that the guidance outlines, we also defined what a traceability system was and why it is valuable beyond food safety. We also provided guidance on how to begin implementing a traceability system, whether you already had some pieces in place already, and how to kind of broaden the scope, the traceability scope of the system that you currently had in place, and how to build upon that. We also outlined the components of an effective traceability system, and then provided several examples of a variety of different labels that folks within the task force provided to us, and then the importance of a lot ID and being able to travel, or that lot ID traveling with the produce no matter where it was in the supply chain. We did identify that a lot of, or some of the feedback that we received was that a lot of times traceability systems break down, is that there isn't that communication in between the supply chain. So having a system that travels along with the produce from essentially a grower right through to the retailer is really the key to success here. On the bottom of the document, you can see, or this slide, you can see a link where this document currently resides. I also put it in the chat if you want to click on the link in the chat. Next slide. This is just an example of the resources and appendices that we put together. We spent a lot of time putting these appendices together because they really gave great examples to anyone that either had no traceability system in place, to somebody that had already a complex traceability system in place that they perhaps wanted to improve. So we have a variety of different templates and guides that people can use in order to create that system. We also identified types of software that could support the generation or creation of a traceability system. And the types of software that we included as an appendix here are either no cost or low cost software types, as well as feedback from folks within the task force on some of the software systems that they currently use. So either positive or negative feedback, which is always useful for someone that's, you know, trying to decide either to use a new software or spend money on software, and which one would work best for their business. I think that's it.
Yeah, and I do want to double down before we go to the next slide. Well, sorry, Don. I do want to double down on those appendices because what I found so fascinating with this group is the appendices really cover, when we were talking about contamination can happen anywhere, the appendices really capture retail. I know one of the big discussions we had was, how do I trace cash sales, right? So there's an appendice talking about cash sales. And I do want to just applaud the New York State for bringing everybody together and also really wading through it. because there were a lot of edits and a lot of input and a lot of, I would say, discussions that needed to happen, right? And I think if we're going to move forward on this, you got to take a step forward. Not that it's the end all be all, but it definitely is the step forward and has a lot of great resources. So thanks so much, Jen, for joining us and talking about that. And she's going to stay with us for questions because we're going to move to the summary slide where that was the highlight of those 3 brief areas that we wanted to talk about. And hopefully they were productive. Hopefully, you know, kind of a better idea about the ag water subpart E, those recommendations on biological soil amendments, because people are having a hard time sourcing synthetic soil amendments. And then, of course, those new traceability resources. There were some questions submitted, but we want to open it up to the Q&A and let you guys ask questions. Before I do that and to wrap this up, I do want to show a slide of the Produce Safety Alliance team because I know several of them are on here and they're out there working day in and day out to address these issues across the country. So if any of you are joining us not from New York and say you live in California or something, we have somebody out in your area that can help you and that you can collaborate with. So I do want to highlight the PSA team and all the work they do. I do want to give you a slide with the Produce Safety Alliance website. I also want to highlight that we have a Spanish website. I know there was a question in the chat box early on about the monkeypox being in Spanish. Produce Safety Alliance does translate all of our educational materials over to Spanish. And so I do want to highlight that on this call. Beyond that, we can finish with the slides and open this thing up to questions and answers.